When I turned 60, I planned a dinner for my family, set the table with my best china, lit every candle I had saved for special occasions, but instead of bringing out a cake, I handed them a printed list of the $300,000 I had spent paying off their debts. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse anyone. I simply placed the papers in front of them and watched the room go silent. What happened after that changed everything. I'm glad you're here, stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're watching from. I never imagined my 60th birthday would be the day I finally saw my family clearly. The dining room looked exactly the way I had always imagined a perfect celebration should. Soft yellow light from the chandelier reflected off polished plates, glasses aligned neatly beside each setting. I had even folded the napkins the way my husband used to like, simple, clean, nothing too fancy. He'd been gone 3 years now, but habits like that don't just disappear. They stay with you, quietly, in the way you prepare for moments that are supposed to matter. I had spent the entire morning cooking. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans with garlic, the same dishes my son used to ask for when he was younger. Back when a family dinner meant something more than just showing up. Back when I didn't have to wonder whether people were coming because they wanted to, or because they needed something. By the time they arrived, everything was ready. The food was warm, the table was set, and I was standing by the doorway with a smile I had practiced in the mirror more than once that day. My son walked in first, phone still in his hand, barely glancing up as he kissed my cheek. My daughter-in-law followed, polished as always, carrying a bottle of wine she probably picked up on the way. Expensive label. Thoughtful gesture. Empty weight. You look great, Mom, my son said, already moving toward the table. I thanked him, even though I could tell he hadn't really looked. We sat down. Plates were passed. Conversations started, but they felt light. Surface level. Work updates. Weekend plans. Complaints about bills, about stress, about how expensive everything had become lately. I listened, nodding when expected, smiling when appropriate. I had learned how to do that over the years, how to be present without being included. At one point, my daughter-in-law laughed and said, I don't know how we'd survive without help these days. She didn't look at me when she said it. She didn't have to. I glanced at the empty space in the center of the table where the cake was supposed to go. 60 candles would have been too much, I thought earlier. Maybe just a small one. Something symbolic. Instead, there was nothing there. And somehow, that felt more honest. Dinner ended the way it always did, with half-finished plates and polite smiles. No one offered to help clear the table. They never really did. I stood up slowly, gathering a few dishes, then paused. This won't take long, I said. They barely reacted. My son was already checking his phone again. My daughter-in-law took a sip of wine, waiting. I walked into the kitchen, reached into the drawer where I had placed the envelope earlier that afternoon, and held it for just a second. It wasn't heavy. Just paper. Numbers. Dates. Records of things I had never once asked to be repaid. I walked back into the dining room and placed a copy in front of each of them. What's this? My son asked, finally looking up. I didn't sit down. It's everything, I said quietly. Every loan. Every payment. Every time I stepped in. My daughter-in-law picked up the pages, her expression shifting slightly as her eyes moved down the list. $30,000 for the credit cards, $25,000 for tuition, $42,000 for the business loan, she read under her breath. The room grew quieter with every number. I folded my hands in front of me, standing at the head of the table where a birthday cake should have been. I added it up this morning, I said. It comes to just over $300,000. My son stared at me, confusion turning slowly into something else. Why are you doing this? He asked. I met his eyes. Because for the first time in a very long time. I was ready to answer that question honestly. My son didn't take his eyes off the paper as he spoke, but I could hear the edge in his voice now, the shift from confusion to discomfort. My daughter-in-law, on the other hand, was already flipping through the pages faster, like if she moved quickly enough, the numbers might rearrange themselves into something less real. "You've got to be kidding," she said under her breath, though there was no humor in it. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I reached for the plates still sitting on the table, stacking them slowly, one on top of the other. The sound of porcelain touching porcelain felt louder than usual, sharper somehow. I carried them into the kitchen, rinsed them under warm water, and placed them gently into the sink. I could feel their eyes on my back, waiting for me to explain, to soften it, to turn it into something easier to digest. But I didn't. When I walked back into the dining room, neither of them had moved much. The food had gone cold. The candles I had lit earlier had burned down halfway, wax pooling quietly at the base. It struck me then how long I had been doing this, setting things up, keeping things warm, holding everything together, while something underneath it all had been slowly cooling off. "This isn't normal," my son said finally, looking up at me. "Why are you keeping track of all this?" I pulled out my chair and sat down across from them, folding my hands in my lap. "I didn't start out keeping track," I said calmly. "I started out helping." That seemed to land differently. My daughter-in-law leaned back slightly, crossing her arms. "Well, yeah," she said. "That's what family does. You help each other." I nodded once. "Yes," I said. "That's what I thought too." There was a pause after that. Not long. Just enough for the words to settle. But somewhere along the way, I continued, it stopped feeling like help, and started feeling expected. My son frowned, shaking his head slightly. "That's not fair, Mom. We never expected anything. We just needed support sometimes." "Sometimes," I repeated softly. I let that word hang there for a moment, then reached forward and tapped lightly on the first page of the list. "This," I said, "is what sometimes looks like." Neither of them spoke. I could see my son's eyes moving again, slower this time, actually. Reading the dates beside each amount. Years of them. Patterns. Not emergencies. Not one-time situations. A rhythm. Most of these, I said, weren't even conversations. They were calls. Short ones. I mimicked the tone gently, not mocking, just factual. "Mom, we're a little short this month." "Mom, can you help us cover this?" "Mom, we'll pay you back next time." My daughter-in-law shifted in her seat, her expression tightening. "Okay, but we did have plans to pay you back," she said quickly. Things just got complicated. I looked at her, not unkindly. They always did. That was the truth. The room fell quiet again, but this time it felt heavier, not tense, not explosive, just undeniable. "I never asked for it back," I added. "Not once. Not when it was 10,000. Not when it was 100,000. I paused. Not even when it became 300. My son rubbed his forehead, exhaling slowly. "So what, this is your way of asking for it now," he said. "Because if that's what this is, you could have just said so." I shook my head. "No," I said. "That's not what this is." And that was the moment they both finally looked at me. Really looked. Because for the first time since this conversation started, they realized this wasn't about the money anymore. My son leaned back in his chair, the paper still in his hands, but now it looked different, like it had weight. Not just numbers, but something heavier. My daughter-in-law set her pages down on the table, smoothing them out with her palm like she was trying to flatten the situation into something manageable. "Then what is this about?" she asked, her tone sharper now. "Because it feels like you're trying to make a point." I nodded slowly. "I am." The honesty seemed to catch them off guard. For a moment, no one spoke. The house was quiet again, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Ordinary sounds. The kind you don't notice until everything else stops. I didn't wake up this morning and decide to do this, I said. This didn't come from nowhere. My son sighed, running his hand through his hair. Okay, then where did it come from? I looked down at the list for a second, then back at him. It came from years, I said. Years of small moments that didn't seem like much on their own. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting my voice stay even, steady. Like the time you called me from the driveway, I continued. You remember that? You were already outside, engine running, and you said you needed help covering a payment before midnight. You didn't come in. You didn't even turn off the car. He didn't respond. You said you were in a hurry, I added. That you'd come back and visit properly another time. I gave a small nod. You never did. My daughter-in-law shifted, clearly uncomfortable now. That was one time, she said quickly. I met her eyes. It wasn't. There was no anger in my voice. That was the part that made it harder to dismiss. It was the same pattern, I said. Quick calls. Urgent needs. Promises attached to them. I paused. And then, silence. Until the next time. My son looked down again, his jaw tightening slightly. We were dealing with a lot, he said. You know that. The business, the bills, I do, I said gently. I always did. And that was the problem. I understood every time, I continued. I made excuses for you. For both of you. I told myself you were stressed. That things would settle down. That once you got through whatever you were dealing with, things would go back to normal. I let out a quiet breath. But they never did. The words sat there, simple and unembellished. My daughter-in-law picked up her glass, taking a small sip of wine, buying herself a second before speaking again. So what are you saying? She asked. That we took advantage of you? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked at my son. Because the truth wasn't something I needed to throw at them. It was something they needed to recognize. I'm saying, I began slowly, that somewhere along the way. I stopped being your mother in those moments. The room went still. My son looked up, confusion flickering across his face. What does that mean? It means, I said, that when you needed something, you knew exactly who to call. But when you didn't, I didn't cross your mind. That landed. Not loudly. But deeply. My daughter-in-law set her glass down a little harder than she meant to. That's not fair, she said. We have lives. Responsibilities. It's not like we can just, call me. I finished softly. She stopped. I held her gaze for a moment, then looked back at my son. I'm not asking for daily visits, I said. I'm not asking for grand gestures. I'm not even asking for the money back. I paused. I'm asking you to understand what this has felt like. The list sat between us, no longer just numbers. It was time. It was silence. It was every moment I chose to give, and every moment I realized I wasn't being chosen back. My son didn't respond right away after that. He just sat there, staring at the list like it had suddenly become something he didn't recognize anymore. My daughter-in-law looked between us, her expression shifting, not softening, but calculating, like she was trying to figure out how to reposition the conversation back into something she could control. You're making it sound worse than it was, she said finally, her tone measured. We didn't ignore you. We just had a lot going on. I nodded slowly, not arguing, not correcting. I know, I said. You always did. That was the truth. There was always something, another bill, another deadline, another reason why things couldn't be different yet. I had believed in those reasons for a long time. I had built entire explanations around them just to make things feel okay. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting my eyes drift for a moment, not away from them, but back through time. I remember when you first asked me for help with the tuition, I said. You were sitting right there, at this table. You didn't even want to ask. You kept saying you'd figure it out on your own. My son's expression shifted slightly, like he remembered. And I told you not to worry, I continued. I said, that's what I'm here for. I gave a small smile, but it didn't quite reach my eyes. I meant it, I added. Because I had. Every time. I wasn't keeping score back then, I said. I wasn't writing anything down. It wasn't about numbers. It was about showing up. Being there when it mattered. My daughter-in-law crossed her arms again, but this time it felt less confident. And we appreciated that, she said. We still do. I looked at her gently. You say that, I replied, but appreciation has a way of showing itself. She didn't answer. I turned back to my son. After your father passed, I said, my voice softening just slightly, things changed. Not all at once. Just, little by little. He lowered his gaze again. The calls became shorter, I continued. The visits became less frequent. And the reasons always made sense. I paused. Until one day, I realized I hadn't seen you in 3 months, but I had sent you money twice in that time. That memory sat heavier than the numbers ever could. I told myself it was temporary, I said. That once things settled down, we'd go back to how things used to be. I let out a quiet breath. But we never did. The room felt still again, but now it carried something else, not tension, not defensiveness, just truth settling into place where it had been avoided for too long. I don't regret helping you, I said, looking between them. Not a single dollar. If you needed it again, back then, I would have done it all over again. That seemed to catch them off guard. But what I didn't realize, I continued, was that every time I said yes without question, I was slowly teaching you something. My son looked up at that. Teaching us what? He asked. I met his eyes. That I would always be there, I said. No matter what. No matter how. No matter how often. I paused. And that you didn't have to be. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was heavy. Because this time, there was nothing left to explain. My son didn't argue after that. Not immediately. He just sat there, his fingers pressed lightly against the edge of the table, like he needed something solid to hold on to. My daughter-in-law, though, wasn't ready to let it settle. So what are you saying? She asked, her voice sharper now, pushing back against the silence. That we're bad people? That we used you on purpose? I didn't react to the tone. I had heard versions of it before, the kind that tries to turn reflection into accusation. I'm saying, I replied. Calmly, that intent doesn't change impact. That slowed her down, just for a second. You may not have meant to, I continued, but it happened anyway. My son exhaled quietly, his shoulders lowering slightly. We never thought of it like that, he said. I know, I answered. And I did. That was the part that had taken me the longest to understand. It wasn't deliberate cruelty. It was something quieter. Easier to overlook. Easier to excuse. I didn't think of it like that either, I admitted. Not at first. I glanced down at the list again, then back up. It started small, I said. A bill here. A short loan there. Things that made sense at the time. I paused. And every time, I told myself the same thing, this is what family does. My daughter-in-law shifted in her seat, her arms still crossed, but her expression less certain now. Exactly, she said. That's what we're saying. I nodded once. But family also shows up in other ways, I added gently. That landed differently. My son looked up at me again, more attentive now. Not just when something goes wrong, I continued. Not just when there's a problem to solve. I paused. But in the quiet moments too. The ordinary ones. The ones that don't come with a request attached. No one interrupted. I started noticing the pattern, I said. Not because of what you asked for, but because of when you didn't call. The words stayed soft, but they carried weight. There were weeks, I went on, when I wouldn't hear from you at all. And then suddenly, there'd be a call. Urgent. Immediate. Always about something that couldn't wait. I gave a small, almost tired smile. And I would drop everything. My son's jaw tightened slightly. I wasn't just helping, I said. I was prioritizing you. Every time. I let that settle before continuing. And slowly, without realizing it, you learned to prioritize me only when you needed something. The room went still again. My daughter-in-law opened her mouth to respond, then hesitated. Because this wasn't something she could argue away. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was just, consistent. I'm not angry, I said quietly. If I were, this would look very different. I glanced at the list one more time, then pushed it gently toward the center of the table. This isn't about blame, I added. It's about understanding what's been happening for a long time. My son looked at the pages again, but this time, he wasn't scanning the numbers. He was seeing the pattern. And for the first time, he couldn't unsee it. My son didn't speak for a long moment after that. He just sat there, his eyes fixed on the list, but I could tell he wasn't seeing the numbers anymore. He was replaying something else, memories, maybe. Moments he hadn't thought twice about at the time. Moments I had held on to longer than I should have. My daughter-in-law, though, shifted in her chair again, her patience thinning. Okay, but what do you actually want from us? She asked. Because we're sitting here going in circles. I looked at her, calm, steady. I'm not going in circles, I said. I'm closing one. That made her pause. My son finally looked up at me again. What does that mean? He asked quietly. I took a small breath, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted the words to land exactly as they were. It means I'm done being the solution every time something goes wrong in your lives, I said. The room didn't react loudly. But something shifted. My daughter-in-law let out a short, disbelieving breath. So you're just cutting us off, she said. Just like that? I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I reached for my glass of water, took a small sip, and set it back down carefully. The simple act gave the moment a kind of stillness that words couldn't. Not just like that, I said finally. It took years to get here. My son's expression tightened slightly. Mom, that's not fair, he said. You can't just decide this without talking to us. I held his gaze. I am talking to you, I replied. That quieted him. For a long time, I continued, I thought if I kept saying yes, things would balance out on their own. That eventually, the giving and the connection would meet somewhere in the middle. I shook my head slightly. But they never did. My daughter-in-law crossed her arms again. That doesn't mean you just walk away, she said. Families don't do that. I nodded once. You're right, I said. That seemed to catch her off guard. Families don't walk away from each other, I added. But they also don't reduce each other to a safety net. The words settled heavily between us. My son looked down again, his fingers tightening slightly against the edge of the table. So what happens now? He asked, his voice lower. I leaned back in my chair, letting the question sit there for a moment. What happens now, I said, is that you figure things out, the way I trusted you could all along. There was no anger in my tone. No punishment. Just a boundary. I'm not disappearing, I continued. I'm still your mother. That doesn't change. I paused. But the role I've been playing in your lives, that does. My daughter-in-law shook her head slightly, like she couldn't accept it yet. This is extreme, she said. You're overreacting. I didn't respond to that. Because I knew something she didn't. This wasn't an overreaction. It was a delayed one. I'm not asking you to agree with me, I said quietly. I'm asking you to hear me. My son looked up again, and this time, there was no argument in his eyes. Just something quieter. Something heavier. Because for the first time, he was starting to understand that this wasn't a moment. It was a turning point. My daughter-in-law didn't accept it, not really. I could see it in the way she leaned back in her chair, arms still crossed, her expression tightening as if she were holding herself together through sheer will. This doesn't make sense, she said. You're acting like we've done something unforgivable. I didn't respond to that right away. Because the truth was, they hadn't done anything dramatic. No shouting. No betrayal you could point to in a single moment. That's what made it harder to explain, and even harder to accept. It wasn't one thing, I said finally. It was everything, added up over time. My son looked at me again, quieter now. Then why now? He asked. Why today? I let out a small breath, glancing briefly at the empty space in the center of the table. Because today felt honest, I said. That seemed to confuse him. I gave a faint smile, though it carried more weight than warmth. Birthdays are supposed to be about celebrating your life, I continued. Looking at where you are, and what matters. I paused. And this morning, when I woke up, I realized something. Neither of them interrupted. I realized I had spent so many years taking care of everyone else's needs, that I never stopped to ask myself what I needed. The room stayed still. I didn't need a cake, I added softly. I didn't need presents. I didn't even need a party. I looked at them. I needed clarity. That word hung in the air. My daughter-in-law shifted slightly, like she didn't like where this was going. Clarity about what? She asked. About my place in your lives, I said. My son swallowed, his expression tightening again. And once I saw it clearly, I continued, I couldn't pretend anymore. There it was. No anger. No accusation. Just truth. I didn't plan this as some kind of punishment, I said. I planned it because I needed to say it out loud. For myself. My daughter-in-law let out a small, frustrated breath. So this is about you now, she said. I met her gaze calmly. Yes, I said. That answer seemed to land harder than anything else. Because for the first time, it wasn't about them. For years, every decision I made started with you, I continued. What you needed. What you were going through. What I could do to help. I paused. Today is the first time I started with myself. My son looked down again, his fingers slowly uncurling from the edge of the table. I'm not saying I won't ever help you again, I added. Life doesn't work like that. Things happen. I shook my head slightly. But it won't be automatic anymore. My daughter-in-law opened her mouth, then closed it again. Because there wasn't an easy way to push back against that. This list, I said, gently tapping the papers, isn't a bill. It's a boundary. The words settled between us, simple but firm. My son looked up at me again, and this time, there was no confusion left in his eyes. Just understanding. Not complete. Not comfortable. But real. And for the first time since this conversation began, we were no longer talking about the past. We were standing in something new. Clara was the first to break the silence again, but this time her voice had changed. It wasn't sharp in the same way, it was tighter, more controlled, like she was trying to hold on to something that was already slipping. So what, she said slowly, we're just supposed to sit here and accept this? Like everything we've built doesn't matter anymore? I didn't respond immediately. I let the question sit there, because it revealed more than she probably intended. Everything you've built, I repeated quietly. My son shifted slightly in his chair, his eyes flickering between us. He didn't interrupt this time. He just listened. I leaned forward a little, resting my hands lightly on the table. I'm not taking anything away from you, I said. I'm stepping back from what was never supposed to be mine to carry alone. Clara shook her head. But that's the point, you were helping. You chose to help. Yes, I said. I did. And now you're acting like that was a mistake. I held her gaze, steady and calm. No, I said. I'm acting like it came with a cost I didn't recognize at the time. That quieted her. My son looked up at me again, more focused now. What kind of cost? He asked. I thought about that for a second. Not because I didn't know, but because it wasn't something you could measure the way you measure money. Time, I said. Energy. Peace of mind. I paused. And something else. He waited. My sense of being valued, I finished. The words didn't come out heavy. They didn't need to. Clara looked away first, her fingers tapping lightly against her arm, a small, restless movement she probably didn't realize she was making. That's not fair, she muttered. We never said we didn't value you. You didn't have to, I replied gently. The room went still again. Because some things don't need to be said out loud to be understood. My son exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the ceiling for a second before returning to the table. I didn't realize it felt like that, he said. I nodded once. I know. That had always been the truth. It wasn't intentional. But it was real. Clara straightened slightly, like she was preparing to push back. Again, but this time there was hesitation. So what does this actually look like moving forward? She asked. Because you can't just disappear from everything. I shook my head. I'm not disappearing, I said. I'm just not going to be the first call every time something goes wrong. My son looked at the list again, then back at me. And if something does go wrong? He asked. I met his eyes. Then you'll figure it out, I said. The same way I trusted you could all along. There was no judgment in my voice. Just belief. And maybe that was what made it harder. Clara let out a quiet breath, her shoulders dropping just slightly, like the weight of the situation was finally settling in. The conversation wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. But it was undeniable. Because for the first time, this wasn't about what they needed from me. It was about what I was no longer willing to give without being seen. My son stared at the list for a long time after that, his thumbs slowly tracing the edge of the paper like he was grounding himself in something real. The room had gone quiet again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. This one carried weight. Not confusion anymore. Not even resistance. Just the slow realization of what had actually been happening all along. I didn't think it added up like this, he said finally, his voice low. I didn't respond right away. Because that wasn't the point. It always does, I said gently. Clara shifted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable with where this was going. Okay, but you're acting like this is all one-sided, she said. Like we never gave anything back. I looked at her, not dismissing it, not arguing. What did you give back? I asked quietly. The question wasn't sharp. But it was direct. She opened her mouth, then hesitated, her eyes flicking briefly toward my son before returning to me. We included you, she said. Holidays. Dinners. We invited you, I nodded slowly. Yes, I said. You did. I let a small pause settle in. But there's a difference between being invited and being valued, I added. That stopped her. My son looked up again, something shifting in his expression, not defensive this time. Just processing. I thought I was showing up, he said. I thought being here when it mattered was enough. I held his gaze. It mattered to you, I said. He frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means, I continued, you showed up when it fit into your life. When it was convenient. When it didn't cost you anything. The words were calm. But they landed. Clara leaned back again, shaking her head slightly. That's not fair, she said. People have responsibilities. We can't just drop everything. I said. That cut through everything. Not loud. Not aggressive. Just true. The room went completely still. I dropped everything every time you called, I continued. I rearranged my life. My time. My plans. I paused. Not because I had to. But because I believed that's what being there for someone meant. My son's eyes dropped again, his shoulders lowering slightly under the weight of it. I wasn't asking for the same thing in return, I added. I wasn't asking you to fix anything for me. I paused. But I was asking, without saying it, that I mattered beyond what I could provide. Clara didn't respond this time. Because there wasn't an easy answer to that. The list sat between us again, but now it didn't feel like a document. It felt like evidence. Not of money. But of imbalance. My son let out a slow breath, leaning back in his chair, his hands resting loosely now instead of gripping the edge of the table. I see it, he said quietly. That was new. I didn't nod. I didn't push it further. I just let him sit with it. Because understanding doesn't come all at once. It settles. Slowly. And for the first time since this conversation began, he wasn't trying to defend himself. He was trying to understand. My son didn't speak again for a while after that. He just sat there, quieter than I had ever seen him, like the space between us had finally caught up to him. Clara, though, wasn't ready to let it settle, not yet. So what are we supposed to do now? She asked, her voice lower, but still holding on to that edge. Because you've made your point. We hear you. But this changes everything. I looked at her calmly. It was already changed, I said. I'm just the one saying it out. Loud now. That silenced her for a moment. My son leaned forward again, his hands loosely clasped, no longer tense, just thoughtful. If we had done things differently, he said slowly, would this be different? I didn't answer immediately. Because that question mattered. Yes, I said finally. That was the truth. The room held on to that word longer than anything else that had been said that night. Clara let out a quiet breath, looking down at the table. So there's nothing we can do now? She asked. I shook my head gently. That's not what I said. They both looked up. There's always something you can do, I continued. But it starts with understanding, not fixing, not explaining, just understanding what this has been. My son nodded faintly, like that made sense to him now. And after that, he asked. I leaned back slightly, letting my voice stay even, grounded. After that, I said, you decide what kind of relationship you actually want with me. Clara frowned slightly. What does that mean? It means, I said, you don't get to assume anymore. That landed. No more automatic calls when something goes wrong, I added. No more expecting me to step in before you've even tried to handle things yourselves. I paused. If you want me in your lives, it has to be more than that. My son looked down again, nodding slowly. And the money? Clara asked, her voice quieter now, more cautious. What about all of this? I glanced at the list one more time, then back at her. I'm not asking for it back, I said. That caught them both off guard. But I'm also not adding to it, I continued. The difference was clear. No anger. No punishment. Just a line drawn where there hadn't been one before. Clara sat back in her chair, processing that, her expression no longer defensive, just uncertain. My son exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands together like he was trying to steady himself. I should have seen it, he said quietly. I shook my head. No, I replied. You should have asked. That shifted something again. Because seeing requires distance. But asking requires intention. And that had been missing for a long time. The room fell quiet once more. But this time, it didn't feel heavy. It felt clear. Because for the first time in years, we weren't talking around the problem. We were finally looking straight at it. And there was no going back to pretending anymore. My son didn't try to argue after that. He just sat there, his hands resting on the table now, not gripping anything, not holding on the way he had before. Clara looked between us again, but this time, there was no quick response, no immediate pushback. Just a pause, longer than any she had allowed all night. "So what happens to us?" she asked finally, her voice quieter, not sharp anymore. I looked at her, really looked at her, not as someone who had taken something from me, but as someone who had never stopped to see what she was asking for in the first place. "That depends on you," I said. She frowned slightly. "On us?" "Yes," I replied. "Because this isn't something I can fix for you." The words stayed simple. Clear. My son nodded faintly, like he understood that now. "You're saying we have to change how we show up," he said. I gave a small nod. "If you want things to be different, yes." Clara looked down at the table again, her fingers brushing lightly over the edge of the paper, but she didn't pick it up this time. She just let it sit there, like it had finally become something she couldn't argue with. "And if we don't?" she asked. I didn't hesitate. "Then nothing changes," I said. That answer settled in quietly. Because it wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a warning. It was just reality. My son leaned back in his chair again, exhaling slowly, like something inside him had shifted into place, even if it wasn't comfortable yet. "I don't want things to stay like this," he said. I believed him. But belief wasn't enough anymore. "Then don't let them," I replied. He looked at me, searching my face for something, permission, maybe. Reassurance. But I didn't give him either. Not this time. Because this part wasn't mine to carry. Clara straightened slightly, her voice softer now, almost cautious. "We didn't realize how it felt," she said. "I know," I answered. That had always been the truth. "I'm not expecting you to fix everything overnight," I continued. "I'm not even expecting you to agree with me on everything." I paused. "But I am expecting you to start paying attention." The room stayed quiet after that. Not tense. Not heavy. Just still. My son nodded once, slowly, like he was accepting something he couldn't ignore anymore. Clara didn't nod. But she didn't argue either. And somehow, that said just as much. I looked at both of them, sitting there across from me, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for something, from them, from the moment, from the outcome. I had already said what needed to be said. And whatever came next, was no longer something I had to control. They didn't leave right away. For a while, we all just sat there, the three of us at the same table where I had spent years serving meals, filling glasses, making sure everything, and everyone, was taken care of. But this time, I wasn't reaching for anything. I wasn't adjusting, fixing, smoothing over the silence. I was just sitting. My son was the first to stand, slowly, like he was carrying something heavier than when he walked in. Clara followed a second later, quieter than I had ever seen her. No quick remarks. No final argument. Just a long look at the table, at the list, and then away. "I think we should go," she said softly. My son nodded, but before turning, he looked at me again. Really looked this time, not past me, not through me. "Mom," he started, then paused. This time, he didn't rush to finish the sentence. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to help him. "You know where I am," I said gently. That was enough. He gave a small nod, like he understood something more than just the words, then turned and followed Clara to the door. I listened as it opened, then closed behind them, not loud, not dramatic. Just a quiet click. And just like that, the house was still again. I stayed where I was for a moment, looking at the table. The plates, half cleared. The glasses, some still with wine in them. And in the center, the list. No cake. No candles left to blow out. I reached forward and gathered the papers, stacking them neatly, the same way I had done everything else in this house for years. But this time, it felt different. Not like I was cleaning up after everyone else. Like I was closing something. I carried the plates into the kitchen, rinsed them slowly, listening to the sound of water filling the silence. It didn't feel lonely. It felt quiet. Peaceful in a way I hadn't realized I'd been missing. When I finished, I walked back into the dining room and paused, my eyes drifting to the empty space where the cake should have been. For a moment, I thought about what this day might have looked like. Candles. Laughter. A simple wish. But then I realized something. I had gotten what I needed. Not celebration. Clarity. I moved toward the window, resting my hand lightly against the frame, looking out at the yard that had held so many years of my life. Nothing out there had changed. The same trees, the same light stretching across the grass. But inside, something had. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel regret. And I didn't feel like I had lost anything. Because the truth was, I hadn't lost my family that night. I had simply stopped pretending they were something they weren't. And in doing that, I found something I hadn't had in a long time. Myself. I took a slow breath, letting it settle, letting the stillness stay exactly as it was. I didn't know what would happen next. Whether my son would come back with something different. Whether things would change, or slowly drift further apart. But for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for that answer. Because love shouldn't feel like a transaction. And being a mother should never mean forgetting yourself. That was the lesson I gave myself on my 60th birthday. Not wrapped in paper. Not served with candles. But stronger than anything I had ever given before.